Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, and welcome back to another lecture on the Greek and Roman historians, in which we are going to now talk about and present an historical overview of Herodotus. Reactions to Herodotus's work have varied greatly, both in ancient and modern times, and his reputation has always contained something paradoxical about it. In antiquity, he was on the one hand, acknowledged as the father of history, the first writer to compose a narrative of the past with the sufficient care and adornment required of high literary endeavor and moral purpose, while treating his theme in a manner that came to be recognized as historical. On the other hand, his history contained much material that was problematic, especially stories of marvels and strange, even unbelievable customs that seemed to undermine the serious purpose of his history. The modern era has had different concerns and interests, yet here too Herodotus's reputation has fluctuated. He has at times been considered a serious practitioner of an activity that, in its essentials, constitutes what is today considered a historical method, and at other times an amiable writer of fiction. It has also been difficult for him to escape from the shadow of his successor Thucydides, who seemed so much closer to modern notions of a historian. Possibly the greatest change, though, that the last 30 years have seen is the near abandonment of the portrait of Herodotus as an well-intentioned, if imperfect, investigator, a man who, striving to become a historian, overcame his obvious failure to actually be one. Such a portrait was based ultimately on a supercilious indulgence and a conviction that we knew so much better than he how to do what he so clearly tried to do and failed. Now, though, things are not so clear. What history is and what purpose it fulfills seem to be very complex and driven questions, driven largely by the needs of the individual societies that use history. Herodotus's reputation has benefited from the expansion of interest in the various forms of history and from the move in our own time away from strictly military and political events to larger studies of culture and society. Given that he has always been considered a storyteller of the first rank, the new interest in narrative method has paid great dividends in expanding our understanding of how Herodotus gave shape and meaning on the small and large scale. The portrait of the simple and naive raconteur has gradually given way to a view of Herodotus as a traditional but sophisticated narrative artist, an heir of both Homeric patterning and Ionian inquiry and storytelling, who encoded into his account of the past interpretive keys for his contemporary audience. Herodotus's reputation has also indirectly benefited from renewed interest in Thucydides, and the recognition of rhetorical techniques and aims in the later historian has had the effect of lessening the teleological approach that saw Herodotus as an important but ultimately failed aspirant towards the perfection of Thucydidean history. Scholars have instead been able to study Herodotus's methods and approach on their own merits as valid ways of conveying to his audience and to later generations a view of both the past and themselves that had meaning in their present. The traditional biography of Herodotus is a compound of ancient testimonia and inferences or direct statements from the work itself. The picture has long been familiar and portrays Herodotus as an indefatigable traveler over 3 continents with a special interest in Egypt, Scythia, and the ancient Near East. In the Greek world, he seems to have spent a good deal of time on Samos, and not surprisingly, in the most powerful cities of the late 5th century, namely Athens and Sparta. While many would still subscribe to this general picture, the biography that I've just sketched has come under attack in years, I would say the last 30 years or so, from 2 angles. On the one hand, there is now a marked distrust in accepting assertions from the ancient biographical tradition, especially for writers or other non-political figures about whom there is not likely to have been a great deal of information. In these cases, it can be shown that much of what ancient scholars report is not based on any independent or contemporary evidence, but rather is composed of inferences from the texts themselves. In addition, ancient critics were eager to create schemata, teleological or otherwise, into which they could place individuals based on stylistic or other criteria, that is, to link famous writers in a chain of influence. This is most evident in the ascription of student and teacher status, as, for example, when Ephorus and Theopompus, the most important historians of their day, but vastly different in style and interests, are linked as students of Isocrates, the most influential rhetorician of his time. Or to take a closer example, when we read that Thucydides was in the audience for Herodotus's readings and decided then and there to become a historian, we see the same sort of student-teacher motif at work. In the Herodotean biographical tradition, the historian is linked with the poet Panyasis, who is either his uncle or cousin, and goes into exile from his homeland of Halicarnassus after participating in a failed attempt at tyrannicide. Although possibly based on contemporary information, the first fact quite conveniently links him to the epic genre, to which he was obviously indebted, as many ancient critics saw, and to the tradition of Ionian historical poetry. The second incident reflects a concretization of the love of freedom so evident throughout his work, and the location of this attempted coup on Samos comes no doubt from the importance that that island held in some parts of the histories themselves, that is, the histories of Herodotus. Similarly, his participation in the founding of the colony of Thurii in South Italy can seem almost too good to be true. What could be a more appropriate mirror of Herodotus's own work than to have him participate in an Athenian-led pan-Hellenic enterprise? The second assault against the traditional picture of Herodotus's biography has been directed against the veracity of Herodotus's remarks about his own travels. This is, of course, in a different category from the objections that I've just discussed about the biographical tradition. Although the approach is hardly new, scholars have again tried to cast doubt on Herodotus's travels, and in its most comprehensive, some would say radical form, it has been suggested by some scholars that Herodotus's source citations are mere literary devices and cannot be used as indications of actual travels or conversations with natives. At least one scholar has even argued that Herodotus never visited so prominent and important a place as Athens, for instance. I will return to this objection, to this aspect, a little bit later in this talk tonight. It will be enough, though, at this point, simply to note that belief or disbelief runs along a spectrum, and some scholars distrust the biographical tradition without disbelieving in the literal truth of the source citations. In this case, Herodotus's work itself must serve as the foundation for his biography. Putting that aside, the earliest 20th century scholarship was much concerned with questions of composition. That is, how the work was put together, and whether it was possible to determine which parts of the histories were written earlier and which later. Because of the heterogeneous nature of the work, at least by our standards, such questions were ultimately bound up with the issue of Herodotus's own development as an historian. For if one believed that books 6 through 9 were the earliest part of the work, it followed that Herodotus was moved at the outset by what we would call an historical impulse, and that only, or mainly, as a consequence of that original inclination, did he subsequently include earlier historical material or material on the cultures and customs of various nations. If, on the other hand, one believed that the Egyptian Logos, that is Book 2, chapters 1 through Book 3, chapter 15, was the earliest thing written by Herodotus, it seemed a reasonable conclusion that his interest in more historical actions and his development of historical narrative only occurred over time, books 6 through 9 would thus represent the end product of his Entwicklung, his development as a historian. In this view, the histories preserved within themselves the evidence for the development of Herodotus from mere inquirer to historian, and this helps to explain the seemingly incongruous nature of much of the material in the work. Thus, Herodotean scholarship, influenced by debates over the composition of the Homeric poems, similarly developed Unitarians and analysts, that is, people who saw the work as being of a unified whole from its outset, guided by a single vision for the entire work, versus those who kind of saw it as being created piecemeal over time and in various different ways. The former, that is, the Unitarians, emphasize that the histories are an organic whole, planned with great care, and reinforced by many themes that run consistently throughout the work. The latter, that would be the analysts who see the whole thing as a hodgepodge, they see a change in Herodotus's interests, methods, and approach over time, even if they might differ on the order of composition, his original interests, whether as an ethnographer, geographer, or something yet different, and the pattern of his intellectual development. Yet all of these attempts to deduce Herodotus's development from the work which he has left us assume a teleology in the notion of history that seems quite culture-specific, to put it in modern-day terms. Or if we put it another way, the notion that ethnography represents an earlier form of historical writing, and history proper represents a later mode of understanding a people or an event, is not something that is at all self-evident. Just as importantly, analysts and Unitarians ask different questions, and each approach explains certain aspects better. However, the histories themselves were composed, well, I should say, however the histories themselves were composed, they had somehow or other to be made public. And the most natural way for this to have been done in Herodotus's time was through public performance of individual parts, or indeed even the whole. Although we do not need to accept the details of, say, Lucian's portrait of Herodotus reading his work at Olympia, there can be little doubt that Herodotus did perform his history out loud in public. And the most likely venues were in public competitions, such as at festivals or commemorative events, and possibly even at aristocratic symposia, just as earlier poetic works on historical themes were also performed there, as we know. We can therefore assume that Herodotus was performing not only in mainland Greece, but also in Asia Minor, and even perhaps in Western Greece, where, as I've mentioned before, tradition linked him with the foundation of the Pan-Hellenic colony of Thurii in southern Italy. That would be in the year 444, or the Athenian year went from summer to summer, so 444/443. We are, however, confronted with the same sort of problem that we encounter in the Homeric poems, that is, the vast scale of the work. Since performance of the entire histories would have taken several days, scholars have tried to isolate discrete or self-contained portions which would be suitable for an evening's performance. The recognition of this oral milieu in which Herodotus was active, based on research that has been done on oral cultures, has been one of the great contributions to Herodotean and indeed classical Greek studies over the past 50 years. In turn, notions of the ways in which the histories were produced and disseminated have influenced our views on long-debated questions. For example, arguments about a publication date now seem far less decisive, whereas at one point they were that was a major matter of scholarly concern. Although it is still generally accepted that Herodotus's work appeared sometime in the 420s, the notion that the assumed parody in the Acharnians of Aristophanes, lines 522 through 529, performed in the year 425 BC, must indicate a terminus ante quem of Herodotus's publication, falls to the ground, since it need only indicate really that the introductory portion of the histories was familiar to an Athenian audience. and such knowledge is just as likely to have been gained from oral performance as from a written text. And in an actual publication of a complete final version, that is what we have today, can have taken place several years later than such an oral reading. Whatever date is accepted, though, for publication, or however one imagines the original dissemination of the work, the main time of composition for Herodotus's work was from the 450s to the 420s BC, a time that coincided with the mutual suspicions and ultimately open hostilities between the two leading powers of Greece, Athens and Sparta. It can hardly be doubted that this period, and at least the early years of the Peloponnesian War, had a formative influence on Herodotus. One can see this not only in the similarity of Herodotus's Persian Empire with the 5th century Athenian Empire, but also in Herodotus's constant and anachronistic focus on the two great powers of his day, Athens and Sparta. Not all scholars would agree, but many now believe that his work bears traces both of the contemporary antagonism of Athens and Sparta, as well as the debates over Athenian imperialism. With war encompassing the Greek world on all sides, Herodotus looked back to a time when the two great powers of his era, who were now tearing the Greek world apart, had cooperated in the destruction of what was, quote, the greatest armament of which we know, end quote. That is a quote from Book 7, chapter 20, section 2 of Herodotus's Histories. The enormous narrative that Herodotus fashioned comprises deeds, monuments, customs, theoretical and practical observations, and a great deal more. Although much analyzed by earlier generations of scholars, the preface continues to attract critical attention, as indeed it must, for Herodotus's work is the first of its type to come down to us, and its author is in general very aware of methodological pronouncements. Any translation of this opening preface will carry some evaluative judgments. There's no question of that. But the following translation that I present for you attempts to be as literal as possible. This is the display of the inquiry of Herodotus of Halicarnassus in order that the things brought about by mankind may not become faded in time, and so that the great and marvelous deeds, some displayed by Greeks, some by non-Greeks, might not be without their renown, both in respect to other things and especially on account of what cause they fought with each other. Now, in announcing his subject matter as things brought about by humankind, ta erga ex anthropon, Herodotus intended to treat both elements in the widest possible sense. The erga, that is, the works, were to include not only deeds, but also works in the sense of monuments or even marvels. And in specifying that they were to be the result of human action, that is, ex anthropon, Herodotus meant all those activities of human beings worth recording and remembering, including their behavior, or in group terms, their customs. By limiting his topic to human beings, Herodotus clearly wished to indicate not that the divine or the gods would not be present, but rather that they would not take the active role that they had for the epic singer. For whatever their influence, the working of the gods in Herodotus are indirect and more easily to be apprehended through the agency of human beings. And the erga ex anthropon, the works of of mankind, as Herodotus has narrated them, are immense. The first surviving work of Greek prose ranges throughout the Mediterranean and the ancient Near East and comes some 50 years fully and nearly 100 years more, covers some 50 years fully and nearly 100 years more summarily. If Herodotus had done nothing more than arrange material that was already to hand, he would still have accomplished something worthy of admiration, for the structure of his work, although simple in some ways, is complex and varied in other ways. Since his theme is also on account of what cause, or we might say what charge, the Greeks and barbarians fought with each other, dia tein aitiein. He begins with the attack of Croesus of Lydia, the first man whom I know to have harmed the Greeks, as he says in Book 1, Chapter 5. And this is his attack on Ionia, just as the liberation of Ionia after the Battle of Mycale will end the entire history. Croesus, in turn, is conquered by Cyrus, and from then on it is the momentum of Persian conquest that gives the narrative its forward thrust. Cyrus's conquests end with his death in the east fighting against the Massagetae, and the movement of Persia is temporarily thwarted. The next Persian king, Cambyses, takes over from his father, and he moves against the Levant and Egypt, adding the riches and power of the latter to his empire. But Persia's forward momentum is again stopped, this time in the south and west, as Cambyses fails to conquer the Ethiopians and Ammonians. After the Median pretender Smerdis is put down, Darius reestablishes Persian rule and accepts and extends his heritage of conquest. His reign sees success, but also defeat, when the Persians can make no headway against the Scythians, who put a block on Persian expansions to the north. Darius, goaded by the sting of Ionian rebellion and the Athenian and Eretrian assistance that resulted in the burning of Sardis, now moves westward and entrusts his commanders to subdue Athens for him. But the Persian failure at Marathon momentarily checks his ambition. His vengeance is left to his son Xerxes, whose huge army and navy are finally defeated by the combined Greek forces at Salamis, Plataea, and Mycale. Herodotus ends his work with an equilibrium that derives from the halting of Persian expansion on all sides, and with Ionia in the place it was before the conquests of Croesus. Such a brief outline of the work which I have just given gives no sense of the full complexity of the material contained within it. Both the large and small scale show evidence of care and forethought. To begin with, it is possible to divide the work in two, an Odyssean half, as it were, with the narrator engaging in travels, reporting marvels, and inquiring into the customs and ways of exotic peoples. There is that half of it, and then there is also an Iliadic half, a war story with emphasis on deeds of bravery and heroism. Herodotus has, in this way, encompassed and rewritten both of Homer's works. In addition, the work exhibits parallelism at the beginning of each half. In both, there is a request from the East for assistance against a foe. Croesus in Book 1 asks for help against the Persians, as does Aristagoras for the Ionians in Book 5. And at each point, Herodotus sketches the earlier history of the two leading states, Athens and Sparta. In Book 1, he takes both cities from virtually their origins to the mid-6th century. In the latter, he takes up their history from that point and brings it to 499. Herodotus also engages in wide-scale patterning, which serves the dual purpose of giving structure and reinforcing themes. The motif of conquest at the end of the world is one example. Each of the Persian kings proceeds with an eye towards conquest of a distant land, and for each one, his defeat at the edges of the earth reinforces the view of violation of boundaries. At times, individual incidents prefigure later ones. Darius's defeat, for instance, at the hands of the Scythians, prefigures the later Persian defeat in Greece. And the Battle of Thyrea in Book 1 anticipates some of the themes and incidents of the Battle of Thermopylae in Book 7. The story of Xerxes' passion for the wife and daughter of Mycistes, the last we see of him in the histories, has numerous thematic resonances with the story of Candaules and Gyges that opens the work, and forms a kind of elaborate ring composition. Despite the momentum of Persian imperialism, the histories are in no way linear, and the forward movement is constantly stopped or redirected by a series of excursiones, flashbacks, flash forwards, changes of venue, narrative pauses, and descriptive passages large and small. Most often this is because of what Herodotus himself calls paranthekai, or prosthekai, and which we usually translate as digressions. The English term often carries with it the notion of ancillary, subordinate, or at worst, irrelevant material, and is thus manifestly unsuitable to describe what Herodotus is doing here, since parantheki perform two important tasks in Herodotus's narrative. In the first, they allow the author, while maintaining the overall linear movement of his narrative, to go backward or sometimes forward in time, and to sketch the background to important events in his narrative of the Persian Wars. Secondly, they contain important material in their own right, which constantly reinforces the main themes of the work or explores and develops new themes. It is thus extremely problematic to make a distinction between the main narrative and the excursions, or to consider the former the more important material and the latter of lesser or subordinate value. The most common type of large-scale digression comes when new nations are attacked by the Persians. Here, Herodotus often sketches a people's history and culture, an entire book for the marvels of Egypt, and about half that much for the equally but differently marvelous Scythians. The earlier history of Athens and Aegina is treated in digressions before the critical battle of Salamis, in which both states play major roles. And in one notable incident, the history of Corinthian tyranny is sketched within a speech by Sophocles that urges the Peloponnesians not to reinstall the Pisistratids in Athens. When Herodotus comes to narrate the battles of the Persian Wars, he often tells the personal histories of major individuals, explaining how they came to be in that position. And not infrequently, he outlines the later history of some individuals who distinguished themselves on the battlefield. It is true that some of this material is what we would call novelistic and deals with apparent trivialities, stories that are included, one might say, purely because they are so good as stories. Arion and the dolphin, Polycrates and his ring, and Hermotimus and his revenge, to name but a few. Yet this material, too, as recent scholarship has shown, serves the important function of reinforcing major and minor themes of the work. Moreover, it is often small incidents of or minor characters that have the greatest effect on grand historical events, and they themselves are part of this interpretation of history. Since Herodotus noted in his preface the rise and fall of states, such that the reader must see designations of great and small as only temporary manifestations, this perspective of looking backward and forward and of examining change over time has the advantage also of situating Herodotus's work in a continuum of historical activity, such that he sees his own work as occupying a specific historical time and place. Herodotus everywhere has an eye for marvels, as his preface makes clear by its focus on great and marvelous works. These marvels are of every conceivable form, and from physical monuments to extraordinary actions. The former tend to cluster around foreign lands, especially since Greece was a poor country and little able to construct vast or imposing edifices at this time, at least in comparison with Egypt. The only exception being in Samos, which Herodotus said has had three of the most marvelous works. But there are also the marvels of action in Herodotus, deeds that are memorable because they stretched the limit of human endurance or achievement. Artemisia's actions at Salamis, the Persian installation of democracies in Ionia, Tilinus of Sicily's settlement of civil strife with only the sacred rites of Demeter and Persephone, or the supernatural occurrences in battles, such as the enormous warrior at Marathon and the spontaneous movement of the sacred arms at Delphi. Related to this is Herodotus's interest in superlatives. The first or finest or bravest, Azotus, withstood the longest siege of all those we know, he says. Of all animals, the crocodile becomes the largest from the smallest beginnings. The Libyans are the healthiest of all men. Hegestratus did the bravest thing, cutting off his own foot of all those we know. These are all stories related from Herodotus. As with marvels, these actions compel admiration or reveal the ultimate limits to which men can go, and therefore give some sense of the world in which human activity takes place. The question of Herodotus's sources, his historical method, and his reliability are all intertwined. Since a belief in the veracity of Herodotus's source citations leads to one interpretation of his method and thus of his reliability, whereas a disbelief in the source citations will of necessity entail a rather different picture. I want to now try to strike a balance between pure acceptance and simple disbelief, but one should be aware that the questions raised are all related, and one cannot talk of Herodotus's method without taking some stand on the question of whether his source citations are to be accepted at face value. Herodotus presents his work as a collection of logoi, that is, of accounts heard by him that have been stitched together into a continuous narrative. Within this structure, the citation of sources is a common and consistent element. The narrative is not necessarily uniform or single-stranded, since in many places rival logoi stand side by side, sometimes with, sometimes without the narrator's comment or preference. In this sense, Herodotus's histories is a work of oral history, of memories retained by his informants and preserved by him in the course of his researches and travels. Taken at face value, his researches reveal an enormous number of sources, all the major Greek city-states, and not a few of the minor ones, numerous foreign peoples, including Egyptians, Lydians, Persians, and Scythians, unnamed functionaries, usually priests, and a very few named informants. In addition, Herodotus seems to have examined inscriptions and monuments and become familiar with oracles, especially those at Delphi. It could well be that to gather and assimilate all of these native sources took the work of a lifetime. The source citations are usually couched in the form of, quote, such and such a person says, end quote. The sense being that of a living tradition, and that these sources serve both as basis for and validation of the account. Herodotus constantly reminding his audience of that inquiry which he promised to display in the opening lines, and of course the word for which in Greek is historiae. The source citations appear in a variety of functions, sometimes cropping up at crucial points just where the validation of an unusual or marvelous incident is needed, but at other times they give variant versions of events, often at the end of a major narrative incident. They may introduce a story, which then continues in the narrator's own voice, or they may control the narrative structure, as for one example, when long passages of the text are in indirect discourse, underlining the fact that the story is being told by a particular source. Herodotus would have us believe, therefore, that his narrative depends throughout on what his various informants have told him. And in two places, he explicitly acknowledges, as a universal practice of his work, that his task is to say what is said, legein ta legomena, without committing himself in any way to believing everything he tells. That at least is the surface image. To what extent the source citations conceal the nature of the original source, and how far they are to be taken as stating a clear and evident truth, has always been the subject of speculation. It was not uncommon in the 19th century to assume that Herodotus had used written sources, possibly those historians named by Dionysius of Halicarnassus at a later date, even though he names none of them save Hecataeus. In more recent years, though, certainly nowadays, the dominant belief is that no or very few written sources were available to Herodotus. That is in part because many of those early historians have been dated to a time after Herodotus's publication date, and it is consequently assumed that he could not have used their works. But as I've noted before, it is clear both that Herodotus's own inquiries took place in a milieu of pervasive historical activity, and that notions of a publication date cannot be pressed too hard, since material might well be available in oral form long before it is written down. Additionally, the argument that Herodotus did not use any form of local annals rests on decidedly weak ground. Felix Jacobi, one of the greatest scholars of Greco-Roman historiography, whose dates are primarily in the very late 19th century, but for the first half of the 20th century. He argued that Herodotus never mentions such annals, and he would surely have used them if they existed. But this is a dangerous argument from silence. To take only a single example, when discussing the island of Chemnus in Egypt, Herodotus says that, quote, "it is said by the Egyptians to float and move about," end quote. In fact, Herodotus said this in one of his works. Whereas many scholars look at this with the question of plagiarism in mind, surely the noteworthy point is that Herodotus attributes to the Egyptians something that was known from Herodotus. In other words, he is accepting Herodotus's information as being genuine local information, even while trying to trump him by denying the miraculous nature of the island. Had we not the fragment of Hecateus that showed he discussed this island, we could argue that Herodotus had not used Hecateus here because he does not mention him. Herodotus's silence, therefore, about local annals does not indicate either that they did not exist or that he did not use them. Certainly, in these matters, it is impossible to be certain about any of these matters, but it must be acknowledged that the case against the use of previous writers is hardly unproblematic. In my opinion, it is not probable that Herodotus's massive work signals the beginning of a genre. Rather, just as the Iliad and the Odyssey have a centuries-long tradition of oral poetry behind them, so too Herodotus's massive work makes better sense if previous treatments of some, possibly many of his topics, too, already existed. The most comprehensive attack on Herodotus's source citations in the last 50 years has been the work of Detlev Phelan, and it has occasioned a variety of responses. Space in our talk right now precludes a detailed discussion, but it may be useful to summarize the approach that Phelan takes. Phelan claims to have found a Herodotean, quote, key to all mythologies. By an examination of the source citations in Herodotus, specifically by studying the places where they appear, just where they are most needed, the perfect way in which they dovetail with one another, even if sources are from widely disparate places, and the predictable rules that they follow, Phelan concluded that such remarks are fictive. That is, they belong to the devices of a writer of fiction who seeks to give plausibility and persuasiveness to his narrative, and they do not in any way represent real inquiries made by the narrator. Reaction, though, against this position, in some ways was predictable, with scholars marching out those places where Herodotus was indeed correct, and they attempted to show how the historian may have misunderstood or been misled on other occasions. Yet many criticisms of Phelan have failed to appreciate that there are two parts to his work. The first is the identification of a number of trends and aspects in Herodotus's work. These are what Phelan calls the rules. And the second is his own, that is, Phelan's own interpretation of these phenomena. One can accept the first without accepting the second, but the challenge then is to substitute a different, although equally plausible explanation. A series of complementary but independent studies that were written in response to this, to Phelan's work, also called into question some of Herodotus's claims by comparing them with native sources, but just as importantly, they pointed out the underlying and deep-seated influences of the Greek tradition on many of Herodotus's accounts. Here, the study of oral tradition has shown just how complex the phenomenon is. The way in which the source citations do fit together is not uncommon for largely oral societies, given how traditions are preserved, and how the mechanics of oral tradition consistently simplify and maintain only that which is relevant. Yet oral tradition by itself cannot explain the problem surrounding Herodotus's source citations, for even oral societies have notions of true and false, do they not? Putting that issue aside, let us now proceed with what can be detected of Herodotus's historical methods. These must be recovered by direct and indirect means. In the first, from explicit remarks made throughout the text, and these are not numerous, nor do they appear in the way that, say, Thucydides would present his method, that is, in a single chapter, elucidating a universally followed procedure. Whether or not it actually would be followed or was followed is a different story. The second and more common way to determine a method is to see how Herodotus employs historical criticism throughout his work. This, however, has its own dangers, since the method to be inferred will not necessarily strike every reader in the same way. To take an oft-treated passage, the series of abductions with which Herodotus opens his history has occasioned very different interpretations. Some seeing this material as in some way rejected in favor of something else, others thinking it is a parody of earlier method, which Herodotus's superior method will now supersede. Still others, viewing it as an example of the kind of material to be rejected by Herodotus, the kind that cannot be known because of its place in the distant past. And there are still yet others who propose that it is an incorporation of poetic and epic material, not so much a replacement as a necessary prelude, the fulfillment of which will be found in the work that is to follow. It is common in discussing Herodotus's historical methods to establish a hierarchy of tools, placing personal observation, or opsis, what is sometimes referred to in scholarship as autopsy, because that literally means seeing for oneself in Greek, um, so the historical method that Herodotus is commonly thought of as putting on the top of on the highest rung of his hierarchy of tools is opsis, personal observation, then akoe, that is oral tradition, and only after that doxa or gnome, that is reasoning about something below that, inferring something. Each of these tools, of course, has its own strength and limitations. Autopsy is most valuable for geographical or ethnographical study, but is of limited use for writing a narrative of the Persian Wars. Oral inquiry is best for learning what actually happened, or at least what people thought had happened, but has a limited range and is often contradictory. And the need sometimes to say what is said without choosing or commenting, that is basically a response to the necessity of working with oral sources. Lastly, reasoning doxa is a contributory factor applicable both to autopsy and oral report, and can be employed when data exist, but the matter itself is beyond the realm of autopsy, such as an explanation of the sources of the Nile, or when material is handed down in different ways by oral report, such as who actually betrayed the pass at Thermopylae. One problem of discerning Herodotus's method arises from the polymorphous nature of the material he includes. When, for example, he states in Book 2, Chapter 99, that his narrative will be based on opsis, akoe, and gnome, does he mean this simply for Book 2, or for this part of Book 2, or is this to be construed by the reader as valid for the entire work? We have no way of knowing. My own opinion is that it is not to be seen as universal, which is why it is stated at that particular moment. And this hierarchy would indeed serve little purpose in the later narrative of a war and its battles, or indeed in the early history of Lydia or Persia. To take only the most obvious point, an assumption that opsis, that is autopsy or personal observation, plays a primary role in the Persian Wars narrative, would suggest that Herodotus practiced autopsy on the battlefields and important sites that his narrative there treats. Yet we have no grounds for assuming this, since Herodotus's battle narratives are notoriously skimpy on topography and tactics. That is not to say, of course, that Herodotus never uses autopsy. Plainly, he does, both for Greek and non-Greek marvels. It is rather, though, to say that the unique nature of the Egyptian logos is responsible for the elucidation of the specific method followed there, since Egypt, unlike Greece, is a land of visual marvels, which Herodotus consistently integrates with the priest's narratives of the great pharaohs of the past. But it is clear that for Greek history, the role of autopsy is of limited use. And here Herodotus would have relied on the memories of living people. Thus, we are on the surest of grounds if we assume that it is oral tradition, however this was gained by Herodotus, that stands as the basis of his work. Even if opsis and akoe, that is, personal observation and oral history, make up the greatest part of Herodotus's historical method, we must not minimize the importance of gnome, or inference, which comes into play throughout the histories, although not often on the obvious and elaborate scale that it does say in Book 2. For by gnome, inference, we must understand all those places where Herodotus conjectures, reasons, opines, debates, refutes, and avers. As I've noted before, Herodotus lived in a time of great intellectual ferment, when new methodologies and new approaches to old problems were coming to the fore. The most obvious, of course, was the sophistic revolution. It has often been assumed that the revolution of sophistic learning passed him by, and that his work retained an archaic viewpoint. Such views have been increasingly challenged, not least because the direct path from mythos to logos no longer seems quite so clear or self-evident anymore. Now, of course, it is obvious that Herodotus is familiar with the new reasoning, and also because his analysis of his analysis of the source of the Nile, for instance, makes this clear in Book 2, chapters 19 through 27. His defense of Athens as the savior of Greece in Book 7, chapter 139. Darius's experimentation with the human differences of nomos in Book 3, chapter 38, and the constitutional debate of Book 3, chapter 80, all of which show unmistakable signs of sophistic techniques. In addition, Herodotus's methodology has a great deal in common with the scientists and doctors of the 5th century, and even in less epideictic passages, it can be shown that he engages with many of the intellectual concerns and debates of the 5th century. There is no reason to doubt, therefore, that he was an active participant in the intellectual revolution of his time. Nevertheless, this does not tell the entire story, for the histories also present examples of the failure of sophistic reasoning, particularly when individual characters employ such methods of argumentation in regard to the supernatural. And so, in an effort to make Herodotus a creature of the Greek Enlightenment, we ought not to overlook the important theme that one finds in the histories of the limitations of human knowledge and of human reasoning. And finally, a word or two just about Herodotus's credibility. Throughout antiquity, Herodotus was a common target of criticism and polemic. Part of this, of course, may be put down to the need that each ancient historian had to establish his own credibility, and therefore to denigrate his predecessors. Yet this cannot by itself be sufficient, since Thucydides, by contrast, was held up as the greatest historian and was only rarely criticized. Critics pointed to two faults of Herodotus above all: partiality and sensationalism. Plutarch, for instance, in his work De Herodoti Malignitate, chides Herodotus repeatedly for omitting the deeds of the Aeginetans, the Corinthians, and other states, while at the same time being too harsh on those Greek states that were forced to betray the Greek cause and go over to the Persians. It is common to dismiss this work of Plutarch, but with insufficient justification, I think, since the criticisms made there can be found in other writers too. Moreover, it is in fact true that Herodotus's narrative is dominated by Athens and Sparta, and other important states such as Aegina and Corinth receive short shrift. Even if we dismiss the more extreme views of Herodotus's relationship with Athens, there can be no doubt that he saw that city as the main reason for the Greek victory, and this clouded his appreciation of the contributions of the rest of the Greek states. The other feature for which Herodotus was consistently faulted was his love of the unusual and the marvelous. To later generations, the fabulous elements in his work made it recognizably different from the way that history had developed after Thucydides. Distinctions of subject matter were later systematized by rhetoricians into three groups: hysteria, that it would be the Latin res gestae, which presents what is probable and actually happened; fiction, that would be plasma in Greek, or verisimile in Latin, which is probable but did not actually occur; and lastly, the mythic or fabulous, to mythodes, or in Latin simply fabula, which is neither probable nor true. This last category was often associated with the stage, which depicted theatrical and by extension unbelievable changes of fortune. Whatever one thought of much of Herodotus's narrative, it could not be denied that some very large portions of it might be considered to consist of the last category. This at least seems to be the gist of Cicero's remark in his work De Legibus, Book 1, Chapter 5, that although Herodotus was the father of histories, one could also find in him innumerables fabulae, that is, innumerable myths. Modern criticism, on the other hand, generally proceeds along a different line. When in the last century, archaeologists began to uncover the remains of the very societies that Herodotus had described, it seemed possible to check his accuracy and reliability in a way that was hitherto impossible. And some of the results were immediate and striking. The decipherment, for instance, of hieroglyphics gave access to Egyptian traditions and history, and not a few scholars were surprised to find a recognizable disjunction between what was there and what Herodotus had recorded. Others, trying to fit the archaeological record into the narrative of Herodotus, came forward with more encouraging results, suggesting that once one made allowances for this or that, Herodotus could be seen as a generally reliable guide to the kingdoms of the ancient Near East, far more reliable, in fact, than many of his successors, who claimed to consult native records and produce more accurate accounts. The results are neither clear nor consistent, therefore. His narratives of foreign cultures are a mix of accurate information, Hellenizing traditions, and the author's own imagination. What does seem clear, however, is that it is unhelpful as well as inaccurate to return to the older, simplistic dichotomies of Herodotus, the reliable historian, versus Herodotus, the tall tale telling liar. Herodotus and his historical activity are complex and cannot be comprehended by either label. Turning now to his narrative manner, his speeches, and his characterization, no reader of Herodotus is likely to miss the continual presence of the narrator in the telling of the histories. As narratological studies have shown, every story has a narrator, a presumed I, who is recounting the events. What makes Herodotus's narrator unique is his intrusiveness, or his presence in the text, the fact that he calls attention to himself in the act of narration. For readers accustomed to a largely impersonal narrative and unobtrusive narrator, this aspect of Herodotus's history is amongst the most enigmatic. The Herodotean narrator is in fact unique amongst ancient historical texts, and even later writers who consciously imitate him have nothing like the number of authorial intrusions that we find in Herodotus. These narrative intrusions take many forms and have a variety of functions. I'll just give a very brief summary overview. At one end of the spectrum, we find the remarks that are, so to speak, purely directional or structural, such as I have said above, or I return to an earlier point in my account. Such statements were necessary, no doubt, because of the size and multiform nature of the histories. But there are also the general remarks on the practice of inquiry, whether it is the language of personal observation, or of oral investigation, or less commonly, of explicit travel. The narrator frequently calls attention to himself in the act of reckoning, either by comparing or calculating, and there are well over 100 passages where Herodotus conjectures motivations and explanations. There are numerous expressions of opinion, although these are sometimes difficult to separate from conjecture, and occasionally a word of explicit praise or blame. At other times, the narrator expresses frank disbelief or dismissal. Herodotus sometimes deliberately calls attention to what he will not say. A particularly noteworthy subgroup here has to do with religious propriety and the unwillingness to divulge secret rites. Yet much more commonly, the inability to say is a narrative device by which Herodotus protects himself from problematic accounts, provides conjectures or opinions, or calls attention to what he can say. At still other times, Herodotus is aware of his role as preserver of memory, and bestower of kleos, that is, renown, as when he refuses to put on record the name of the Delphian who inscribed the name of the Lacedaemonians on a vessel actually dedicated by Croesus, or when he refuses to record those Greek writers who have taken over the Egyptian doctrine of the soul's transmigration, and he will not remember the name of the Samian who stole the money of Ctesippus' eunuch. Conversely, he is well aware in certain contexts of his power to memorialize, as when he calls attention to his putting on record the name of Ephialtes as betrayer of the pass at Thermopylae. As scholar Carolyn DeWald has remarked, quote, each authorial interruption again reminds us that Herodotus's narrative is not an unmediated transcription of res gestae, of things that have happened, but a set of authorial choices. They are designed to make us remember that the narrative surface is itself an artifact. Like glass, it connects but also inevitably separates us from what we would see through it. But why would Herodotus do such a thing? Why would the author of a mimetic narrative strive in a thoroughly unhomeric way to remind his audience constantly that what he heard was directly mediated through the author himself, who was the source of the mimesis? Clearly, a first reason is that Herodotus, for all his imitation of Homer, is not an epic poet, and he wishes to have before the audience's eyes the constant effort on his part to shape the narrative. The persona reminds them of the effort that is the basis of his reliability. At the same time, Herodotus has no wish to hide, indeed, rather, he wishes to emphasize that his activity in inquiry has met with a variety of results, and that the level of certainty in his narrative is neither consistent nor assured. The result being that his audience will be able to exercise their own critical faculty in accepting or rejecting his logoi. Too great an assurance everywhere may have seemed unbelievable. In addition, the critical assault on logoi, the fact that Herodotus sometimes narrates stories he says he himself does not believe, points up the problematic nature of all logoi as historical artifacts themselves that must be judged and evaluated. At the same time, Herodotus's intrusive narrator must be seen in the context of late 5th century oral performance culture. Herodotus is not the only author who calls attention to himself throughout his work, and an excellent parallel may be found in the writers of the Hippocratic Corpus. For instance, the narrator in the treatise known as Airs, Waters, and Places is every bit as intrusive as Herodotus is. Now, when we notice this sort of coincidence, it is natural to assume that Herodotus, too, partook of the agonistic milieu that G.E.R. Lloyd sketched for the medical writers, in which public displays of learning were judged and appreciated by a larger public. This agonistic or competitive quality has also been isolated as an important element in Herodotus's narrative persona, and it has been suggested that either individual or general polemic motivations lay at the heart of the narrator of the histories. Individual in the sense that he contradicts certain predecessors, or general in that he tries to present his own views as superior to current or general beliefs. Finally, it has been noticed that Herodotus, as a dispenser of praise, as a guardian and promoter of kleos, renown, serves on the level of prose the same purpose as Pindar does in poetry. Like Pindar, Herodotus calls attention to himself as the recorder or shaper of tradition and the dispenser of praise. In regard to the speeches, Herodotus's work abounds in speeches. They range in length from Hippocleides' three-word epigraph in Book 6, Chapter 129, to the full-scale six-page debate on the invasion of Greece in Book 7, Chapters 8 through 10. The speeches serve a variety of functions. In the more novelistic episodes, they convey an immediacy of tone and in situation. Often, when paired, they give the quality of mimetic drama to the listener. They are used to establish character, point morals, and to draw conclusions. At times, in the more historical sections, they are used as digressions on earlier history. A striking example is that of Sophocles, the Corinthian, who sketches the history of the tyrant Cypselus within the framework of a debate by the Peloponnesian allies on whether to restore the ousted Hippias to Athens. This is Book 2, Chapter 92. I'm sorry, Book 5, Chapter 92. They serve as well to explain strategic decisions, as when Croesus explains to Cyrus why he should fight against the Massigatai on their side of the river, or Mnesicles details for Themistocles the advantages of fighting in the narrows. Herodotus will also use the figure of the tragic warner or wise advisor for the purpose of inculcating moral precepts, virtually always ignored, or to indicate alternative strategies that might have been employed. The wise advisor often appears within the context of a full-scale debate, and he plays a large role, especially amongst foreign kings contemplating aggression. In the ubiquity and variety of speech, Herodotus reveals himself to be very much the creature of an oral society and the imitator and rival of Homer. In terms of characterization, ancient critics considered Thucydides to be the historian of emotion, Herodotus of character, and indeed Herodotus has occasion to introduce hundreds of characters, from lowly servants to exalted kings. What they have in common, though, is that they have done something that Herodotus felt was worthy of being recorded, whether it was a memorable saying or deed or bravery under dire conditions. Herodotus was well aware, even without having read Aristotle on the difference between poetry and history, that a work dealing only in discrete and unrepeatable occurrences stood little chance of being a vehicle for the preservation of kleos. The individual facts or characters presented also needed, as Thucydides later showed clearly, to have something of the universal about them. It is the treading of this line that has led scholars to wonder to what extent the characters in Herodotus are actually individuals or whether they are types, or even at worst, stereotypes. The question, of course, takes on added interest when the author may be a historian, since a reversion to type would suggest less of an interest in the actual and discrete facts of an individual's life, and thus might be seen to compromise the reliability of the historian. To Herodotus's great credit, he has fashioned few characters that can be described as stereotypes. Even the divide that he announces at the beginning, that of Greeks and barbarians, is not a fixed marker, without subtlety and gradations. Even more so in his fashioning of individuals, Herodotus has portrayed people with complex reactions and a mixture of traits. Characterization takes two forms in Herodotus, that of individuals and that of groups. Within each group, he may portray Greek, Spartan, Athenian, or otherwise, or non-Greek, Scythian, Persian, Egyptian characters. What distinguishes Herodotus's characters is the individual and yet recognizably universal qualities that form people. In the story of the birth of Cyrus, for example, the crucial role is played by the herdsman and his wife, to whom the infant Cyrus is entrusted with the orders to destroy him. Book 1, chapters 110 through 113. Both husband and wife display the emotions one would expect in such a situation, a mixture of awe and fear before their superiors. However, the wife also shows great cleverness and calculation, as well as a surprising daring in urging the husband to use their own recently dead child as a decoy for Harpagus' men. He adds to this an argument from utility, namely that their own dead child will benefit by receiving a royal burial. And in doing so, she instigates a plan, the consequences of which will be far greater than she could ever realize. Indeed, they will change the course of history. One notes similarly the deft touch in the story of Cypselus, in which the men of Corinth surround Labda's bed, waiting for the birth of the child. They intend the child's destruction, while she assumes that they are present out of interest and affection. When the child is finally born, she hands it to the first man, and the child smiles. Finding himself by this small action unable to dash the child to the ground, as had been planned, he hands it to the next, but each man in turn is unable to commit the deed. However, not surprisingly, despite the vast number of characters in Herodotus's work, attention has mainly focused on the public figures of the histories, namely the rulers and leading men of the city-states or nations. Particular attention has been paid to kings and tyrants, both because of their ubiquity and because they are an important element in deciphering Herodotus's views on freedom and despotism. Herodotus's method of characterization is indirect, the narrator being somewhat reticent in evaluating the people of his work. Indeed, this very reticence has allowed some scholars to see Herodotus's view of tyrants as basically neutral, while others have assumed that the narrative contains within it all the evidence of a strong antipathy and studied rejection of such types of government. On balance, it must be admitted that Herodotus does not approve of one-man rule, whether it be the form of a tyrant or king. There is, in fact, only one absolute ruler who is unambiguously credited with good rule, and that is Diocles, the first king of the Medes. Despite isolating himself and requiring his subjects to build a splendid city for him, and despite his demand that all matters be submitted to him only in writing, Herodotus says that Diocles governed well and administered justice strictly. Perhaps, in this case, it is not coincidence that Diocles had previously demonstrated his justice to his fellow citizens and was chosen by them for the office of ruling them, as we read in Book 1, Chapter 98. Diocles aside, sole rulers are portrayed very harshly in the histories. Donald Latiner, 1989, has amassed a great amount of evidence that Herodotus's portrayal of both Greek tyrants and barbarian kings relies on a consistent range of behaviors, which include the destruction of ancestral law, the exile or death of opponents, the violation of women, and the dismemberment of the community. Single-man rule is also marked out by its lack of accountability. The people are subject to men of great volatility, but have no recourse when their rulers exercise power. Now, it is worth noting that although there is a set of consistent behaviors for kings and tyrants, not every sole ruler has every trait, and this goes some way towards avoiding stereotypes. Additionally, many kings have characteristics that are clearly admirable. It is noteworthy, for example, that Herodotus portrays several kings as curious and inquiring, the very same interest that he himself has as a writer of historia, that is, of course, of inquiry, of history. The closest that Herodotus comes to a stereotypical portrait of a ruler is that of the Persian king Cambyses. Here, Herodotus has overlooked the actual achievements of the king and has instead focused on his instability and madness. Cambyses' conquest of Egypt, a high point of Persian expansionism and a considerable achievement in itself, is treated briefly so as to focus instead on Cambyses' ill-fated attempt to conquer the unattainable Ethiopians. Above all, Cambyses serves the important purpose in the work as the man who violates both divine and human nomos, custom or law. And his actions call forth one of Herodotus's most spirited remarks about the force of custom, namely, that Cambyses must have been mad to violate custom, since it is clear that all people value their own ways more than those of others. Nor does Cambyses violate only human custom, since he attacks and ridicules the Egyptian god Apis. Not surprisingly, the retribution that accompanies his downfall has all the markings of the divine about it, for Cambyses dies from the mortification of a wound located in exactly the same place where he had wounded the bull of Apis. That is, we read in Book 3, Chapter 64. And yet, significantly, Herodotus's most stereotyped portrait is also one in which the historian is convinced of the madness of the subject. Much more typical of Herodotus's art is his characterization of Xerxes, who dominates much of the narrative of the later books, especially 7 and 8. The memorable Xerxes of Aeschylus's Persians, a callow and overconfident youth, becomes for Herodotus a man of complex emotions and ambitions. Originally not interested at all in invading Greece, he becomes the archetype of the ruler who oversteps his bounds and is punished on the grand and small scale. Aeschylus had shown a man soundly defeated on the political front, but Herodotus shows him destroyed in all ways. His army and navy are soundly conquered by the Greeks, who at the end of the histories stand poised to take the war into Asia, the Persians' own territory. And our last view of the king is as the unwilling destroyer of his own house, his wife having attacked and mutilated the wife of Mecistes, and Xerxes himself forced to have his own brother Mecistes killed when the latter was planning revolt. And yet the Xerxes of Herodotus's work is hardly one-dimensional. He is moved by the devotion of his subjects in Book 7, chapters 27 to 28. But in the next moment, he can punish them mercilessly, as in Book 7, chapters 38 through 39. He can have the Hellespont branded and whipped because it did not accede to his wishes, Book 7, chapter 35, but can also piously pour a libation to the sun at this same Hellespont, Book 7, chapter 54. And on the morning of the Battle of Thermopylae, he does the same thing. That is Book 7, chapters 223. He can award the clever Artemisia, Book 8, chapters 103, while beheading his more loyal Phoenician subjects in Book 8, chapter 90. He can destroy the temples of the Athenian Acropolis in Book 8, chapters 53 and 54, but he can also order the Magi to sacrifice at Troy to the heroes there, Book 7, chapter 43. And he can treat individuals with contempt and disdain, Book 9, chapters 108 to 109, while at the same time he weeps for the general condition of humanity in Book 7, chapters 45 through 47. So Xerxes is a complicated person, and so too is his commander, Mardonius. He's vain and self-assured, deluded throughout in his evaluation of the Greeks. Yet, nevertheless, when put to the test, he dies fighting on the battlefield, with his Persians loyally defending themselves to the end. Herodotus's characterization of peoples, therefore, are nuanced, and so it is for the large groups of people taken as a whole. If we just take the two main examples, the Spartans and the Athenians, the Spartans are dilatory and at times concerned only with their own safety, and they are astoundingly brave. So their devotion to their liberty and to their way of life and so on, their desire to stand up virtually to a man, to a vastly superior army of Persia, is clearly a very positive portrayal to counterbalance the negative qualities. Not so clever as the Athenians, the Spartans can nonetheless show superior sagacity, as when they refuse to support the Ionian revolt in Book 5, chapter 97. And at Plataea, their initial fear of the Persians leads them to change wings with the Athenians, Book 9, chapters 46 through 47. But in the actual fighting, they withstand a punishing Persian assault until the omens are favorable, and then they fight again, most bravely of all, Book 9, chapter 71. so helping Pausanias to win the fairest victory of which we know, as Herodotus says in Book 9, Chapter 64. By contrast, the Athenians already have those characteristics by which they were known in the Peloponnesian War: cleverness, daring, self-serving aggression, and self-sacrificing bravery. For them, of course, Herodotus has reserved one of the few explicit lengthy praises, which we read in Book 7, Chapter 139, in which he extols their daring, their wholehearted commitment to the anti-Persian cause, and their self-sacrifice throughout, abandoning their land not once but twice. To them, Herodotus gives the honor of controlling the outcome of the war. Whichever side they joined was sure to prevail. Book 7, Chapter 139. Yet these same Athenians can be fooled into supporting the Ionian revolt. They can be just as self-serving by threatening to make peace with the king or to abandon their homes and settle in Italy. Book 9, Chapter 11, and also Book 8, Chapter 62. More ominously, in their last actions after Mycale, they already begin to look like the aggressors of Thucydides' 50-year period that he describes in Book 1 of his histories, attacking territory and inflicting savage punishments. And so it seems that they are ready to take on the role of aggressors in the next cycle of history. And here, at this final point of the histories, the dividing line between Greek and barbarian seems to be very thin indeed. In terms of themes, one of the most important ways in which Herodotus gives unity to his work in his is in his articulation of themes. Despite the vast canvas of the work and the varied nature of the material, a few overarching themes recur with enough frequency to serve as leitmotifs. Fundamental to Herodotus's worldview is the notion of vengeance or retribution, just retribution. Thesis is the Greek word here. The commitment of unjust acts and the subsequent retaliatory actions of those injured occur with consistent regularity in the histories. Already at the outset, we are presented with a series of stories of mutual abductions. There are, it is true, apparently, these are dismissed, apparently, but for the more historical beginning point of the work in Cyrus, these are nevertheless there for a purpose, namely to show a chain of events, however remote in time and indeed likelihood, that links Herodotus's major theme of the conflict between Persia and Greece with the epic and Homeric world. The first extended narrative, that of Candaules and Gyges, already shows the mechanism of events, the initial injustice, in this case Candaules' violation of his wife's eidos, or sense of shame, provoking a retribution conceived and implemented by the wife, which is in itself a violation, in the sense that a man kills his king, that will be avenged within several generations. And this pattern, with many variations, will be repeated throughout the work, both by individuals and nations. Harpagus will exhort Cyrus to claim his rightful place as king, but it is clear he does so in order to have vengeance on Astyages, who had destroyed his son. The Corinthians bring assistance to the expedition against Samos because a generation before they had been slighted by the Samians. And Darius invades Scythia, seeking retribution for the Scythian invasion of Asia. As the Persian wars approach, vengeance plays a role here too. Darius claims that he must punish the Athenians and Eretrians for their participation in the attack on Sardis, while the Athenians are motivated to take vengeance for the Persian destruction of the temples on the Acropolis. There is no suggestion that this movement back and forth ever stops. Indeed, it is the force that keeps the world in balance, and that, as in the natural world, ensures that no one power becomes too great. The histories conclude with three final acts of retribution: the Greek defeat of the Persian forces of Plataea, the destruction of the Persian navy and army at Mycale, and the punishment meted out to Artaxerxes for his violation of the shrine of Protesilaus. Whether or not we are to see in the Athenian attack on Sestos with which the histories end, some unjust act that will require retribution in the future, is uncertain and debated. But there is no reason to think that the principle of retribution that Herodotus had so comprehensively described would suddenly disappear after the Greek victory over Persia. A parallel theme, and it is often associated with retribution, is that of the instability of human fortune. Again, Herodotus invokes this theme at the end of his preface, when he remarks that he will go through great and small cities of men, because the cities that were once small are now great, and those once great are now small. This is Book 1, Chapter 5. Reversals, indeed, like retribution, are part of the fabric of history, affecting people and states alike. The lowly become kings, and kings become slaves. The prosperous are brought low, the poor raised on high. What lies behind this seems to be the common Greek belief that prosperity brings perils in its train. First enunciated by Solon and reinforced throughout Herodotus's work, the belief is that no human life is without unhappiness, and the greater one's prosperity, the more danger there is of retribution. Those who succeed on a grand scale attract the phonos ton theon, the jealousy of the gods, who then see to it that the balance is restored. The story of Croesus, placed first because of its programmatic importance, epitomizes this impersonal movement of eudaimonia, or happiness in the kind of state of being sense. Felicity. Almost immediately after his meeting with Solon, where he expected to be named happiest of all mortals, he meets with reversals. First by the loss of his son, the result of an act of kindness on Croesus's part, and then by the loss of his kingdom. Placed upon the pyre by Cyrus, he recalls the words of Solon, and not coincidentally, it is the thought of the mutability of human affairs and the fear of retribution that persuades Cyrus to take Croesus down from the pyre. Book 1, Chapter 86. Perhaps the most developed story on the mutability of fortune is that of Polycrates, who is distinguished by his consistent good fortune. Even when warned by his friend Amasis to do something to bring about some sorrow in his life, lest he have unmixed good fortune, he fails to lose the ring that he loves. We all know the story. Amasis tells him to cast his most prized possession away. Polycrates decides it is the ring, and he throws the ring into the sea, only a day later to be brought a huge fish, brought by one of his servants to him. The servant says, "I caught this fish and it was worthy of a king." And so when they were cutting it open, lo and behold, the ring was inside of it. It is at this moment that Amasis renounces his friendship, for he knows that some great destruction will visit Polycrates, and Amasis does not wish to feel the grief he would experience if his friend suffers. And in the end, of course, Polycrates meets with the greatest misfortune, not only losing his own son, but himself murdered in a manner not worthy to be recorded, says Herodotus, and his body hung up on a cross. This is Book 3, Chapter 124 through 5. Although it is true that at some points in the narrative the gods are involved in human affairs, it is not true that changes in fortune are always or exclusively brought about by the actions of the gods. Granted, Croesus could not have foreseen that his purification of a murderer would destroy his son, nor could he know that he had to pay the retribution due to the Heraclidae for Gyges' murder of Candaules. But it is Croesus' own greed and desire for more that makes him decide to attack Cyrus's kingdom. When the power passes to Cyrus, this imperialistic movement continues, and the king's dissatisfaction with their own prosperity leads them to commit transgressions in their restless forward movement of expansion. Their actions very frequently involve them in a transgression of boundaries, often made manifest in the narrative by the crossing of some natural boundary. Cyrus meets his death having crossed over the Araxes River. This is Book 1, Chapters 211 to 14. Cambyses' attempts to subdue the Ethiopians and the Ammonians lead him to cross impenetrable deserts, and disaster strikes on both fronts. The army sent to Ethiopia is reduced to cannibalism, while that making for Amon's oracle is swallowed by the sand and never seen again. This is in Book 3, chapters 25 through 26. Darius's attack on Scythia brings him over the Hellespont into Europe, where he fails to conquer the ever-receding Scythians. The last in the series of boundary crossings is also the most elaborate. Xerxes at the Hellespont has his first bridge swept away by the water, and enraged by this, he orders the Hellespont to be branded and whipped like a disobedient slave. Themistocles later characterizes him as a man, quote, who dared to lash the sea with whips and bind it with fetters, end quote. One who was punished, quote, by the gods and the heroes, who were jealous that no man in his godless pride should be king of Asia and Europe too, end quote. Not coincidentally, Artaiches is crucified at the very spot where Xerxes yoked the Hellespont. Another prevailing concern for Herodotus is that of difference, made most evident in the contrast between Greek and non-Greek. In the early, let us say, Odyssean books of the histories, Herodotus is the expounder of foreign cultures, ranging from the ancient Near East to North Africa. Even in the later books, he does not lose sight of foreign cultures completely. An earlier generation had seen in Herodotus a prototypical anthropologist, reporting customs with care and generally with dispassion. Indeed, it is worth noting that in contrast to many later writers, Herodotus is remarkably reserved in judgment, favorable or hostile, when expounding other nations' customs, no doubt because he genuinely believed not that all customs were fine and equally valid, but rather that custom was the creation of a society, that nomos was the creation of a society, and that as such it was problematic for an outsider to pass judgment on the efficacy of a different society's beliefs and practices. Nevertheless, the paradigm for Herodotus's ethnographic work invoked today is more that of a tourist than anthropologist. Herodotus is not so much interested in studying the cultures of other people as he is simply in seeing them, marveling at them, and comparing them to his own. As a series of studies has shown, Herodotus proceeds with a fixed grid in his head, not only for the rubrics under which he reports customs, but also with the larger matrix of specifically Greek culture and Greek ways of doing things. It is the great achievement of Werner Hartog's The Mirror of Herodotus to have shown how profoundly the Greekness of the historian determines the way in which he proceeds when looking at a foreign land. Hartog's specific focus was on the Scythians, who represent in Herodotus an anti-Hellas, as he puts it, in that they lack established polis, city-states, and their whole life seems an inversion of the Greek one, of fixity and permanence. Even their method of fighting, retreating on horseback, is an inversion of the hoplite standing his ground. But the world of opposites is not unique to Scythia, as a glance at Egyptian society shows, for there too Herodotus is interested in the difference between Greek ways and Egyptian ways. Certain customs, much more than others, arrest his eyes, and these tend to focus predominantly on religious practices and relations between the sexes, such as marriage rights and the role of women in foreign societies. Even within his examination of religious matters, Herodotus focuses mainly on issues of cult, sacrifice, particularly important to the Greeks. And a foreign nation's pantheon is also usually treated and almost always assimilated to its Greek counterparts. What is lacking, however, is the sense that any nation could have a completely different notion of the divine, and thus Herodotus's exposition never proceeds beyond a certain level and imparts a certain sameness to the religious views of other people. Nevertheless, it would be wrong to assume a hard and fast line between Greeks and barbarians. It is not surprising that Herodotus was open to the later charge of being a barbarophile, since he refused to demonize the Greeks as opponents, and instead represented them as multifaceted individuals, combining both admirable and repellent characteristics. On the other side, there is a consistent strain of criticism throughout the work of Greek ways and institutions, often placed in the mouths of non-Greeks. There are able rulers amongst the Medes and Egyptians, destructive tyrants amongst the Greeks. At times Persians fight bravely and Greeks poorly. Councils of debate that most Greek, which is the most Greek of customs. These are held by barbarians, while sometimes fear and rivalry prevent the Greeks from openly examining issues. At the very end of the histories, it looks as if the Athenians are becoming the new aggressors, taking on the characteristics of the barbarians they have just defeated. So even here, as so often with Herodotus, it is not possible to draw hard and fast lines, and there is a certain permeability of custom and manner. One particular other that permeates the history is women. It is perhaps in consequence of his wide range of interests that Herodotus, more than any other ancient historian, focuses on the actions of women. They appear more than 300 times in the histories, and they have a wide variety of roles. But it is their presence in public affairs that is so striking in Herodotus. Although they are traditional victims in the series of seizures that opens the works, they quickly become initiators of actions in the Gyges story, where Candaules' unnamed wife sets in motion the series of events that lead to the change in dynasty. Atossa and Artemisia occupy important positions of power to Xerxes. Tomyris, the queen of the Massagetae, takes horrible vengeance on Cyrus, and Pheretime of Cyrene is herself the victim of a violent retribution. It is not coincidental, however, that the primary female actors are non-Greek: Nitocris, Tomyris, Artemisia, and Pheretime, to name a few. The Greek women, by contrast, appear in secondary or supportive roles. Thus, women in charge partake of that alterity that is a mark of the foreigner, even if, as in other matters, so too here in Herodotus, there is no simplistic pattern to the way they are portrayed. Individuality rather than stereotyping is the main impression one takes from their actions in Herodotus. No reader of the histories can possibly miss the pervasive presence of the supernatural realm, especially the world of dreams, oracles, and divinities. Although Herodotus announced his topic as the things done by men, ta genomena ex anthropon, and although the gods and heroes do not actively partake in the events as they did sometimes in epic and even historical poetry, nevertheless, Herodotus's world is permeated with many manifestations of the divine. There is, in fact, first and foremost, the avid interest in the religious practices of barbarian nations, as I've just explained. Rituals aside, though, there are other manifestations of supernatural powers, especially oracles and dreams. In both of these, there is a need for human interpretation and explanation, such that the presence of oracles and dreams in the text shows not only that the gods do play a role in the world, but also that there is a complex interplay between the gods and human beings, as the latter try to read the intent or warning of the former. Oracles play a fundamental role throughout the work, advising certain courses of action, all the while requiring human interpretation to explain them. There is, however, no way of knowing, except in retrospect, which interpretation is the correct one. Herodotus gives no hints, for example, why Themistocles correctly interpreted the wooden wall oracle, Book 7, Chapter 143, and the traditional diviners did not. Similarly, with dreams, although here the wrong interpretation is almost always made at first, and only afterwards do the events themselves point this out, there is a clue to proper interpretation of the gods' messages. Herodotus often does not supply it, though. In fact, the great differences between the way the signs from the gods can be interpreted may suggest an upper limit on the powers of human reasoning. Yet at times, Herodotus thinks he sees very clearly how the divine is operating, and he is not cautious of invoking the gods as an explanation for events. When the Persian ships are destroyed in a storm of Artemision, Herodotus says that the gods are attempting to make the Persian and Greek forces more even. This is Book 8, Chapter 13. In another case, the historian agrees with the Patadians, who say that the Persians destroyed by rising water. That the Persians destroyed by rising water during the siege on Pellene were paying the penalty for their previous attack on Poseidon's temple. Book 8, Chapter 129. At the Battle of Plataea, no Persian was seen to enter into or die within the goddess's sacred precinct, because, Herodotus suggests tentatively, the goddess herself would not receive them, because they had burned her shrine at Eleusis, Book 9, Chapter 65. These are statements made by the narrator in his own person. In the narrative itself, however, Herodotus has more indirect ways of invoking the divine. The Persian attack on Delphi, for instance, Book 8, chapters 36 through 39, may serve as an example of Herodotus's care in this matter. The supernatural occurrences that form part of the narrative are noted as marvels. Again, Book 8, chapter 37, and either are focalized throughout individuals or intelligible in natural terms. It is the priest of Apollo, for instance, who sees the sacred weapons brought out from the temple and lying on the ground. This is Book 8, Chapter 37. When the Persians attack, there is thunder and lightning, and two mountain peaks are torn off and fall to the ground, killing many of the Persians. Book 8, Chapter 37. Again, agency is left unclear. It is not known who throws the lightning. It is not known that Zeus who throws the lightning, although the scene has a strong supernatural cast to it. Herodotus then ascribes to the Persians themselves the statement that they saw two men of gigantic size pursuing them, and again, same book, chapter 38. And he has the Delphians identify these as their heroes, Phylacus and Autonos. Book 8, chapter 39. It seems wrong, therefore, to eliminate or minimize this aspect of Herodotus's work. He has portrayed two levels of causation at work, that of the divine and that of the human. If the gods intend to bring the haughty low, they do so with the help of human agents. Yet it is equally wrong to fail to see that Herodotus does have some notion of an assigned or determined portion, which we might call fate. It is clearly expressed by the oracle's reply to Croesus that Apollo had won 3 extra years for him, but in the end could not turn aside the fate that Croesus was to fulfill in atonement for Gyges' murder of Count Daulis in Book 1, Chapter 91. The sense of something that had to happen is most clearly seen in the story of Xerxes' dream, where Xerxes' decision not to invade Greece is countermanded by the dream, which predicts great punishment for Artabanus if he tries to turn aside that which must happen. The unnamed Persian before Plataea remarks that no human can turn aside that which must come from God. Not all remarks about what was going to be necessarily imply some sort of divine plan now, and much less divine action. But neither can these remarks be dismissed purely as a narrative strategy. For at bottom, they reveal that Herodotus does indeed believe the divine to be at work in the world. In these, as in all matters, in order to make a proper evaluation, one must look to the end, as Solon advises Croesus in Book 1, Chapter 32, because not every ending is revealed at the beginning, Book 7, Chapter 51. The only true evaluation of someone or some action comes at the end. For Solon, this was, of course, a person's death, and in all of his examples of happiness, the manner of death is a crucial factor. But historians also look to the end in their narrative, and not surprisingly, the conclusion of the histories sums up many of its most important themes. Following the accounts of Plataea and Mycale, themselves endpoints of a sort, Herodotus narrates 3 separate stories: Xerxes' passion for the wife of Mycistes, the punishment of Artaxerxes, and, briefest of all, Cyrus's advice to the Persians who wished to change their dwelling place. The first of these stories, Book 9, chapters 108 to 13, share several motifs with the opening account of Candaules and Gyges. Both stories center around the passion of a king who violates custom, nomos. In both the guiding force, and in both of these, the guiding force is a woman, and in each the victim plans revenge. For a work that has kings at its core for much of its compass, this final portrait of Xerxes not only completes his individual features, but also stands in some sense for the dangers of monarchical rule in general. Xerxes displays these features that Otanes in the constitutional debate had said were characteristic of monarchs. Book 3, chapter 8. 80. These would be envy, power without responsibility, inconsistency, and violation of women. The second account, that of the punishment of the Persian governor Artaxerxes, is particularly rich in thematic echoes. This is now the section, Book 9, chapters 114 to 21. In Artaxerxes' crime, we see a violation of the sanctuary of the hero Protesilaus, an archetypal transgressor, since he was the first man in the Trojan War to leap from the ships of the Greeks onto the soil of Asia, a boundary transgression that again links Herodotus's narrative with that of Homer. Artaxerxes' death at the hands of the Athenians is explicitly said to be vengeance from the hero himself, as the Persian governor recognizes from a portent during the siege of Sestos. This is in Book 9, chapter 120. Here, then, Herodotus joins up the themes of East and West, Trojan and Persian, impiety and reverence, and the working out of justice through retribution. To this story is attached a brief vignette that is particularly provocative. Some earlier scholars used the passage as additional evidence that the work was incomplete. But recent analysis emphasizes the thematic links with the work as a whole. Cyrus, in this little vignette, sums up the situation of the histories as concisely as possible. He says, quote, "Soft countries breed soft men," end quote, "and those men must prepare to be ruled rather than rule." The stark contrast brings us back to the opening of the work once again, and the actions of Croesus, who first subjugated the archetypal soft people, the Ionians. Their liberation by the Greeks at Mycale, narrated only a few pages before, brought the wheel full circle, as Ionia was liberated a second time. Now, though, with the world in the same balance as it had been before the histories commenced, Cyrus reflects on the distinction between discipline and luxury, or even laxity, as well as freedom versus slavery. The Persian choice that Cyrus presented then was to live in a rugged land and rule over others rather than to sow plains and be slaves to others. That seems to be the choice before the Greeks at this point also. Their victory brings them to a crucial point common in the history of nations, where they must decide whether and how to move forward. Herodotus here leaves his story at a liminal point, with the Persians driven from the mainland and the Athenians seeking to expel them from the Hellespont, a mirror image of how the conflicts began and possibly a breathing place before the next cycle of aggression and retribution begins to take effect. In conclusion, I just would like to mention some brief remarks on the Nachleben of Herodotus, that is, on his reception among later writers. It was once common to assume that Herodotus's influence on the later historiographical tradition was not nearly so widespread or prevalent as that of his immediate successor, Thucydides. But this viewpoint has now certainly changed. Even if later historians, for the most part, adopted a manner of writing more closely resembling Thucydides than Herodotus, the latter nevertheless continued to exert an important influence on later writers, particularly when one was writing non-contemporary history, when the sifting and evaluation of earlier accounts needed to be done. We may begin, then, with Thucydides, who betrays Herodotean influence in his choice of the war monograph, developed by Herodotus, of course, in the main part of his work, books 5 through 9. In certain linguistic imitations, also, Thucydides owes a debt to Herodotus, and in his digressions. Even more significantly, Thucydides' narrative of the Sicilian expedition is profoundly indebted to Herodotus for many of its themes and patterns. Xenophon, although mimicking a Thucydidean manner of narration, has more in common with Herodotus' worldview and his works, particularly the Hellenica, reinforce many of the themes found in the histories. And if Felix Jacobi's hypothesis is true, namely that local history arose as a reaction to Herodotus's pan-Hellenic history, then his work will have been responsible for an entire new genre of history. In the next generation, interest in Herodotus continued, and he became, at that point, an especial target of polemic, which he was to remain in to the end of antiquity. Ctesias of Cnidus, in his Persica, claimed to base his work on native records and contradicted Herodotus everywhere, calling him a mythmonger. Duris of Samos reworked material from Herodotus, and Theopompus made an epitome of his history. And in the Hellenistic period, Hecataeus of Abdera and Manetho both wrote accounts of Egypt intended to contradict Herodotus. And yet it was Herodotus's larger interest in cultures, rather than simply military and political history, that provided for historians of non-Greek lands a template of how to present themselves to a Greek public. With the establishment of the canon of historical authors, Herodotus, Thucydides, and Xenophon formed a triad of first-rank historians, the triad, one might even say, the ones most worthy of imitation. In the late Republic, Dionysius of Halicarnassus imitated Herodotus the most consistently of any surviving historian, and he defended him in his critical writings as equal or superior to Thucydides. Amongst the Romans, Herodotus was praised by Cicero and Quintilian alike, and his influence can certainly be detected in the Alexander historian Curtius Rufus. Under the Empire, Plutarch's De Herodoti Malignitate, which I mentioned earlier, is a full-scale assault on Herodotus, combining many previous criticisms with additional ones of the author's own, arguing vehemently that the work favors the barbarians over the Greeks and spoils the glorious achievements of the victory over the Persians by concentrating on the differences and quarrels amongst the Greek city-states. Criticism, though pervasive, did little to prevent him from being read. The father of history remained popular throughout the centuries, admired for his exceptional style and narrative gifts, for his moving representation of heroic actions, and for his discernment of a moral pattern in the workings of history. Thank you.